Welcome to Short and to the Point, a podcast from the Comeback in Awful Announcing. Here's your host, Jessica Kleinschmidt.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Short and to the Point on the Comeback in Awful Announcing. An exciting guest, a repeat guest, but a good friend of mine, Amy Lawrence. She said goodbye after 12 years to her show After Hours, formerly of CBS Sports, now Infinity Sports. And for a long time, you've heard her on the radio airwaves, and she made the tough decision to say goodbye. It was on her account after receiving a contract that she wasn't too happy with. And you can read it on her blog that she did tweet out on X right on her account. She actually just posted it earlier on Thursday, if you want to read it. Very transparent about everything that went down. We did talk about that and more. Like I said, we're really good friends. So I heard about this a couple months ago. And actually, when I was driving to Reno, heading into Christmas break, which was a great way to have a 3-hour drive go by fast. So bless her heart. And she just made the decision after a long time. And it wasn't due to the fact that she just got married. So please back off. We always want to blame the significant other, but that wasn't the case. She just had her final show on Super Bowl Sunday. So talk about going out with a bang. She was in Vegas for Radio Row, and it's one of her highlights of her year. And we all know how hectic those types of days can be. And just really happy for her and to see what her next venture is. And imagine having 12 years of memories and 20 years really of radio interviews and reliving all of those. And each interview is individual and memories and so many things you can think about. I've had so many interviews that I reflect on, and she has too. And I've learned so much from her, and knowing that she's going to continue, and she has such an art for her Q&As and what she's able to do. And I've learned life lessons from her, and we have such a great friendship and very beloved. So it's no surprise that she received a flooding of thank yous and love from her loyal listeners. So here's my chat with her. Well, Amy, I'm so glad you're back. And like you just said, regulars are one thing, but having my dear friends is even better. You just had a big announcement. I don't have to announce it myself, but tell me a little bit more about this new transition and a big lifestyle change for you as well.
Yeah, it certainly is that in every way. It's not just a professional change, but it's also a personal change. And there's a little bit of both that went into this decision. It wasn't one that I arrived at lightly. It wasn't easy. It wasn't a split second. You know what? I think I'm done on a whim. And because you and I talked about this the last time that I was on your show, it's one that I've been considering for a year and a half at least. So going back to before I got married, which my poor husband, a lot of people blaming him for this. It's not that simple.
It's always, honestly, it's easier to blame the husband, honestly. Yeah.
Or in sports, how often do we hear fans blaming the wife or the girl? Right. So it's not his fault. He's actually been really supportive. And if I had chosen to sign another contract on overnights, I have no doubt that he would have rolled with the punches and made the sacrifices. Poor guy never gets the TV remote because it's always about the sports schedule. So I think the biggest thing was just needing a change, both personally and professionally. In this business, 12 years doing the same thing over and over. It's not that I didn't enjoy it. I loved it. And I really feel like that joy is what gave me the energy and the strength to get through all of it. But the challenge became routine, a little stale. And with a lot of the changes in our business and not for the better, meaning financial, economic changes. Yeah. You and I have also talked about this. It's fewer and fewer people doing more and more of the work. It's a heavy load to carry, and overnights come with their own challenges. Oh my gosh, Jess, for years, I've been reading those articles about how working overnights is detrimental to your health. And I laughed. I thought, oh, that's really funny. I got this. I can be the exception to the rule. But eventually it does catch up with you. So if you include the, 8 years that I did at ESPN Radio, which was mostly nights, plus the 12 years of overnights with what was originally CBS Sports Radio, it's been 2 decades of this, and I feel like I'm getting old before my time. So it's time for a change.
You mentioned the change. So it's not fully going away, but walk me through the steps of all the actual changes that are involved, because I know you made the announcement and you saw all over social media the outpouring of love, and we'll go into that specifically in a little bit. But what are the actual next steps for you at the moment?
Well, that's a good question. I'm really actually thankful that I don't have something I'm jumping right into immediately, because I do need an opportunity to get right set up. I've talked to some colleagues who have come off nights and gone to, different day parts, or come off mornings, which is also extreme when you're awake at 2:30 in the morning and sports take place mainly at night, right? So any type of schedule like that, which takes away from your sleep or doesn't allow you to be in a regular sleep routine, it takes some time to come off of it. And so I'm really thankful that I don't have anything I'm jumping right into. But I am looking for a new challenge professionally as well, wanting something that isn't quite so beholden to what just happened on the field, the court, the ice. So working nights, that's so often what happens is you are committed, or at least I was committed, to talking about all the results as they were taking place, or the news as it was breaking. And since the pandemic, I felt like I've gotten more interested, I guess, in topical radio, long form discussions, longer interviews, that type of thing, a little less stuck to and connected to all the events that were just taking place at night. So that's one thing. I'm looking for just a little bit of a new challenge professionally. But at this time, talking to a lot of different people in the industry, it's been really cool to hear the reaction from them and the congratulations. But honestly, at some of the messages, at some of the points over the last few days, I felt like I'm dying, I'm disappearing, I'm going away. I mean, I have too much to say to go away for very long. So I will be around. And radio is all I've ever wanted to do since I was 16 years old. This is a first love. It's my passion. I couldn't up and give it, just quit and give it up, because it's a part of who I am. And it's still something that I really enjoy doing. But I would love to get back into play-by-play. I haven't done that in a few years. I would like to even teach more at Syracuse. So I've got my spring class coming up again, the art of sports talk. But I'm sure you've noticed, you do a lot of interviews in the course of your multiple jobs. Interviewing is a lost art. There are some really bad interviews out there. For instance, the tell me abouts I can't stand, or asking yes, no questions. Or, as I tell the audience a lot of times, when your kindergarten teacher told you there was no such thing as a stupid question, she was lying. There are so stupid questions, and timing is everything, right? And so I have thought about pitching a class or creating a class just about interviewing. So I really enjoy the teaching aspect for college students right now. Mentoring is a lot of fun. As my brother said to me recently, and such a great point, for the last 12, 13 years, you haven't been available. You've been in a contract that I willingly signed and I was happy about, but it did limit the options somewhat. And so I'm really looking forward to seeing what else is out there.
And you also you wrote a blog about this too, and it was very transparent. And why was it important for you to put a pen to paper and express what was going on?
Well, as you know, the truth is irrelevant a lot of the time on social media. And when people don't have answers, they tend to create their own, come up with things. Like I said, my poor husband's getting blamed for this, and this is happening too. I know it was a choice that I struggled with, when to tell people that I was going to be ending the show. And I've known since mid-December. The company asked me to stay on through Super Bowl week, and I'm glad about that because of our affiliates and the audience. That's a really heavily trafficked time of the year in sports media, of course. And so I chose to stay, but I didn't think that I wanted to tell people with 2 months remaining, because I didn't want some farewell tour, and I didn't want it to be all about me. I wanted to be able to focus on the show, wanted to be able to think about football and playoffs and news and coaches, and just focus on the interviews without it being all about me. And so I dropped the bomb, if you will, on Thursday night into Friday morning, barely over a week ago. And then my last show, you're not going to catch the whole audience, right? So my last show is Super Bowl Sunday night into Monday. And it's been such a drastic reaction, I think in large part because of that. But people saying to me, how could you build up this audience and then drop us? How could you get everyone to listen to your show and then disappear? And so that's weighed heavily on me. I mean, that's been honestly the hardest thing, is feeling like I let people down. But I do appreciate the reaction. You know, what's been incredible is finding out from people how long they listened, how much the show became a part of their typical routine, appointment listening, if you will, but also people that I've never met in person. And, you know, I could walk down the street in New York City tomorrow and nobody would recognize me unless I start. Well, I've been on the phone before on like crowded train platforms and people have recognized my voice. But for the most part, I can move about with anonymity. And that's great. I never want to be famous ever. And so I think the part that is so neat for me is to hear how people value me as either a friend or in some cases part of the family. And I walked through with this audience, the loss of, well, my grandmother turning 100, being separated from her during the pandemic, celebrating her birthday, and of course the loss of her, the loss of a pet, which for me was drastic. And I know for a lot of people, it's really painful. And natural disasters and man-made disasters. And we've shared life for the last 12 plus years. And to hear from people how much they'll miss that companionship has really impressed upon me that the show accomplished what I wanted it to, which was a connection with people.
And on that note, I mean, obviously we don't know and we can't anticipate what the reaction would be, but what were your thoughts on heading into the announcement? What were your thoughts on what the reaction could be? And then when the reaction did happen, I mean, did it come as expected or come as advertised?
Well, honestly, up until the moment that I opened my mouth on the air Thursday night, so it would have been Thursday of Super Bowl week, going into Super Bowl weekend, I didn't know exactly what I was going to say. I didn't want to apologize because I'm not sorry for making this move. Right. But at the same time, how do you take a few minutes and try to explain what's taken a year and a half of preparation and decision making and put that into a succinct few phrases? And so I just opened my mouth and started talking. I said I really didn't have anything prepared, and that's true. I'm grateful. I'm grateful for the opportunities and the experiences, but at the same time, it is time for a change. You know, honestly, I was equating it to athletes and how often we as fans, we get so connected and we get so, we believe there's a loyalty there with athletes, and that's true, except they don't feel that same loyalty from their companies, right? And so when it's time for them to move on, a lot of times fans feel like they're getting ditched by athletes or dumped by athletes. And how could you leave us? And it feels so personal. And I feel like there's a bit of that. But if we can dial it down to, hey, it was a job for 12 plus years, and I'm ready for a new job, and I'm ready for a change, and I need something different, maybe people can identify with that. I'll be honest with you, I did not anticipate the flood of emotions personally. So I have been really stoic. I've been very steady about, business-like, about a professional about these last couple months, even knowing that it was coming. And it's been hard. I mean, even getting out of the house on Super Bowl night, like, oh my gosh, this is so hard. How did I do this for 12 years? Leaving the house in a snowstorm in the dark and getting into New York City to do the show. So I knew that this was the right time to make the choice. What I wasn't prepared for was that flood of emotions and the tears mixed with the joy, mixed with just the bittersweet component of closing a door after pouring heart and soul into it. Yeah. We built it from week one. It didn't even have a name, right? Yeah. And in week 2, a listener suggested After Hours with Amy Lawrence, and it stuck and it was perfect. But it took 12 years of effort to get to the point where it's a show that people recognize. And I'm, again, so grateful for that. It wouldn't happen without the people who hired me or the people I worked with who also worked with me and partnered with me on the show, or the listeners. So that's all hard to leave because I get very emotionally attached to everything I put myself into. I know that you understand that. It's a labor of love. It's not just a job. It never has been. But at the same time, from the moment I turned down the contract offer that I received, this weight just went whoosh right off my shoulders. And I knew it was the right thing to do. I still know it's the right thing to do.
This is going to be a long I'll eventually land the plane when it comes to the question. But
okay.
When it comes to radio, and I know you and I have been friends for a while, but fell into my lap on accident. And I know I was talking to Howie Rose about this. And when it comes to radio and sports, it's the one platform that hasn't changed over the years. It's personal, it's intimate, it's something that, you know, is romantic. And I don't want to get like Moneyball on it, but especially in baseball, it hasn't changed. And I think the element that makes it more important in that medium is because it brings you closer to the people that are listening. And that's definitely an important element. But the other important element is the person behind the mic. So I'm not surprised that people were flooding you with the wishes and that you deserved all the emotion. So you add those two together. And I think that has a lot to do with it, because despite you walking down the street, they may not know your face, but I think that's way more personal than you could ever get with somebody on TV, because as you know, and I mean, I started on TV, you have to say so much in a 30-second window,
right.
But you may not know that person at all. But you have an hour and a half show, you're taking phone calls, and you may have raised that person over 12 years. And you're walking up to, I mean, we're aging ourselves, but you're walking up to the speaker and you're talking to them. But I may not have a connection with somebody that I spent a 30-minute show in between commercials and graphics compared to somebody that I've spent time with on a radio broadcast or on a show. And, you know, I know you talked about the long form interviews, and that there's a connection there that you can't get on different mediums. And now that we've introduced social and podcasts and those types of things. So do you think that has a big reason why? Because that was probably more difficult for them to say goodbye to you, because there's a different connection there that you can't get in other platforms, especially because that's the one medium that has stayed true throughout the entirety of all the different mediums and media that you've had through sports.
Yeah, true. It's all of that is so true. It's very personal. It's very intimate. And I think the other thing is that you have time that you just don't have anywhere else, save podcasts.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I talk about with my students at Syracuse is trying to stand out in a field of, well, a very crowded field, but a field where there are 8,379,000 podcasts for every topic under the sun. So how do you distinguish and differentiate yourself as a host? And what I always come back to is there's always going to be someone who can give a better analysis, who can give a better breakdown, who's got a cooler stat, who has a better story, who knows the players better than you do, I'm never going to be able to compete with the former pro athletes, well, I mean, current pro athletes who have their own shows and podcasts, or the coaches who can break down film. That's not me, but that's okay. I can look at sports, life through my own eyes. And so I tell my students, there are a million options. There's only one you. And when you get to the point where you, through whether a radio or a phone or some other device these days, because you can access it so many different ways, and I'm grateful for that. It's not just terrestrial radio anymore. When you get to the point that people care about you as a person, it honestly doesn't matter what you talk about anymore. And to that point, I did an entire show on cheese once, your favorite cheeses. And I'm sure, I know in the industry, some of our affiliates made fun of that. Whatever. It was probably the show that we had more engagement than anything.
Yeah.
Final Four breakfast foods. I mean, seriously, who doesn't love breakfast foods?
Yeah.
Even something like your favorite dog breed, and great story about that. We did it a few years ago, and there was a man listening in Alaska who was getting ready to run his first Iditarod. He was a rookie. And so we adopted him, because he called in to tell us that Huskies were the best dog breed and why. We adopted him. And for the next 5 months, we walked with him through the process of getting ready to as he was training, getting ready to run his first Iditarod. An incredible opportunity to partner with him. We adopted him as Matt the Musher, and people still ask about him. But I'll give you another example. About 5 months ago, our neighbor, obnoxious light that he put up on the side of his garage. It's a floodlight. It lights up not just our backyard, but the entire back of our house. It is, you can see it from a satellite, Jess. I'm not kidding. It's so obnoxious. And he refuses to either put a cover on it or turn it off. And it's disrupted our sleep. It's I can't even tell you how intrusive it is. And so I told that story out of frustration about 4 months ago on the radio. Every single day, even now that I'm done, I'm still getting questions. What happened with the light? What's going on with the neighbor's light? How will we ever find out about what happened with the neighbor's light? I mean, it's stuff like that. Because people are not one-dimensional, right? And on radio, you have the time and the option and the ability to share personal stories. I could go on and on about the number of ways that I've connected with people, moving during a pandemic, because that's as much fun as it sounds, right? Just the ways that we as humans can relate to one another and identify, because eventually we all go through the same stuff. And I'm just so grateful that people have chosen to share that stuff with me. And I mean, that's the beauty of radio, as you point out. It is more than just a talking head. In fact, it's not that at all, because you usually can't see us, right? Although a lot of shows are on YouTube now. But I love that. I love the mystery of it as well. Not everything needs to be disclosed. We don't need all access to everything, right?
I agree. And you can always introduce those elements.
Yes.
Later on, especially now, you can introduce the visual
like you
element.
have done. Yes.
Yeah. Which is, I kind of did the opposite thing, which was weird. Like I said, I accidentally fell into radio, but it was a happy accident, if you will.
Well, you're a talker, girl. You're a natural.
Thank you. But it's funny you mentioned the husky and the cheese, because one of the biggest articles I ever wrote is a hot dog a sandwich for 4th of July.
Exactly.
I got Joey Chestnut in on it. I got Josh Donaldson. Like actually Joey Chestnut and I had a full-on argument at a Stanford football game about it. And it was probably my most clicked on article, but you got to do what you got to do.
That sounds just like you, actually.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I was not standing down to Joey Chestnut. I don't care. I do.
You can take him, Jess. You can take him.
Like I did on live TV too. Like I got in an argument with somebody because I'm not just going to fall, and it's interesting when it comes to being a woman in this industry. I feel like we have to walk and talk about our resume. We have to kind of prove ourselves. And you mentioned when you talk about the years in the industry, I don't want to say like you have to prove yourself, but you have to prove yourself a little bit more. When you think about the years you have, whether it's you're doing play-by-play or you're in sports radio, does it feel like that those many years? Does it feel shorter than when you say 12 years or 8 years or what have you? Or do you feel like that's about right?
No, it feels like it's flown. I can't believe that it was 20 years ago this year that I made my jump to network radio. So starting at ESPN radio, doing a few sparing shifts here and there. It's funny. A lot of people know the name Freddie Coleman. He's still with the network and just celebrated 20 years. And I was like, dang, we auditioned the same weekend. So he got the job. There was an opening. He got the job. He's terrific at it. He's finally made the move from nights to afternoons. And I'm so happy for him. We spoke on the phone a couple days ago and we were just reminiscing about the fact that 20 years ago, we were there that same weekend. And wow, the paths that we have walked since then. But I've grown up so much since the start of this show. And going back to so initially the first 2 years with CBS Sports Radio, it was 3 shows on the weekends, Friday, Saturday, Sunday nights. And then it expanded to 5 nights a week, 2 years in. And I've grown as a host. The first big step was the 2 bosses that hired me, Mark Chernoff and Eric Spitz, just telling me, we don't want you to be anyone but Amy. And honestly, it sounds kind of crazy that only happened in 2013. But Jess, I'd never heard that from a boss before then.
Yeah.
So you want to talk about the difference between being a male or a female host in this business. I had program directors and managers and bosses who wanted me to be more like the guys. And when you're younger, you take the advice that's given to you. You don't know. You have to figure it out. Sink or swim kind of a thing, trial by error. But these bosses, they said they hired me to just be Amy. And that confidence, I wanted to reward it from day one. So I've grown as a host. I mean, I've gotten more confident. I've gotten more daring. I am not afraid to stand on my own 2 feet and do the exact opposite of what the rest of the industry is doing. Can I tell you how much I hate hot takes? They drive me berserk. And so I swear some of the time, my entire goal on the show is to be the opposite of a hot take. So just to be different, but you don't know to do that or how to do that until you have the time to explore that, but also until you have people who believe in you. And, I'll be honest, when I was at ESPN radio, because most of the time I was a freelancer and I got paid when I worked when they called, I was a little afraid to get
Right.
outside, the box, if you will. And so it took a few years of believing in myself and then these bosses believing in me too, to recognize that it was okay to take a risk. It was okay to fail on the air
Mhm.
because I wasn't going to lose my job because I screwed up, right? And so yeah, that process, not only have I grown as a host, but I've also grown as a person. And I mean, I waited a long time to get married. That new element of my life is so precious to me. But it's not just that. My nieces were kids, little kids,
Yeah.
when I first got this job, and now they're young women, and they look up to me and they talk to me about the challenges they face as females in their industries. My
Yeah.
oldest niece is an engineer, and so she's a female in a place where there aren't as many. And so we've talked about the challenges of being one among many, that you stand out just because of who you are and your gender. So it's been really neat. I love mentoring young female broadcasters who are coming into the industry, and guys too, actually.
Yeah.
It's not just women.
Right.
Whoops. Stuck. See, I'm not used to being on camera, Jess.
Right.
Look what you're doing to me. So it's all of these things: growing as a person, growing as a host.
Put the mic in front of your shoulder.
Are you sure?
Yeah, because I think since it's behind you, you can't hear it as well. Yeah.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
All right. See, this is what I need you for. So all of those things. I'm a different person. I'm a different host. And to be perfectly honest, I wouldn't have made this leap without another job 10 years ago. There is no way that I would have been prepared to even be out of work for 2 weeks, 2 months. I said to my husband recently, it's been 15 years since I didn't know when my next radio show was.
Right.
And there was a time when that would scare the crap out of me, but it honestly doesn't now, because I know that there's something coming along. I know that my talents and skills and abilities are unique. And at some point, there will be a new adventure and a new challenge.
And you mentioned the be yourself thing, and you're right. It does sound simple. It sounds easy, but to me, it doesn't, because we're surrounded by people we look up to, and don't get us wrong. And especially when you're watching TV, you're listening on the radio and you think, well, if they have it, I should be like them. Earlier on in your career, was there ever an internal struggle where you were so nervous to be yourself? You kind of mentioned it, but were you nervous what was the strategy to kind of step outside step outside to be yourself, if that makes sense? Because you don't want to screw anything up. You don't want to let anybody down, but you especially don't want to let yourself down. So how do you find the balance of that?
One of the bad pieces of advice I got early in my career was don't laugh when you're on the radio, because as a female, that takes away from your credibility. It's almost
being a funny woman is the biggest load of shit ever. And I know that's like being a funny guy, you get far in life. Being a funny woman, you have to take 3 steps back. It sounds so silly. I'm so sorry. I've realized this recently, and it's a whole thing. But anyways,
and I'm not even funny. I just laugh at everything, right? I laugh at mistakes. I laugh at what we see, what we hear. I just can find the humor. I do not take myself seriously. I do not take the job seriously. What we do is not important. It's impactful and it's entertainment, but it's not important. So in no way am I going to hold myself up like some really important person in our business. I don't see myself that way. And I have always felt like laughter is the best way to navigate any tough situation. Although sometimes I definitely laugh in inappropriate times when I'm nervous. So I think when I first got that piece of advice, it was hard for me. I struggled because this was a boss who was in charge of how much I worked and when I worked. And I thought, what if I defy him? But it was very limiting to me on the radio to not be able to smile or laugh or feel like if I did, he was going to say, hey, what did I tell you? You're taking away from your credibility. And beyond what he said, I actually wondered, is that true? Do people not take me seriously because I laugh? And you know what, Jess? It just got to the point where I didn't care anymore. If you honestly didn't believe I knew what I was talking about because I laughed on the air, then that's a you problem, not a me problem. But it took a few years to get to that point. And again, the confidence of managers who said to me, we just want you to be who you are. We like your personality. We think you know your stuff. We need you to be bolder in that. I actually had one of my former bosses say to me, you need to get bolder. You need, and this is why I'm not a host with a co-host, it's not because I don't like to work with other people. It's because what I generally tend to do is facilitate. And what I do is I ask them questions, right? I want them to feel more comfortable. It's my personality. And so for me to be bolder and to express myself and really flesh out my opinions, it meant being on my own as opposed to subverting my opinions to someone else. So all of this is part of the process. But yeah, I think early on, the part about not laughing or not showing any personality, and I outgrew that, right? I outgrew that at ESPN radio. I needed to be able to differentiate myself other than just being the only female voice there at the time.
Yeah.
I wasn't really allowed to stretch my wings and fly. I wasn't allowed to do any of that, right? I was kind of stuck in a box. And so it took this big step and joining CBS Sports Radio at launch, which is scary enough, right? It's brand new. Think about the number of new media ventures that have collapsed in the past few years. It is scary to take a leap of faith and wonder if it's going to work. But I'm really grateful because that's what I needed. Honestly, I needed someone to tell me, you're fine just the way you are. It's great just the way you are. Don't change who you are because you think it needs to be a different way. Don't fit the mold, essentially.
Right. Totally. Oh no, I love that. And I think it's good that we're finally at a place where we're embracing that. Like my boss the other day told me to push the envelope. And I remember thinking but I'm like, you told Jessica Kleinschmidt to push the envelope. I'm going to get weird, but okay. Like, just remember that. Like, I just picture myself doing something weird. I'm gonna look over at my boss, like, you gave me permission to
be this. Weird. You said
like,
so.
I'm like, I know there are cameras on me and I don't know where my shoes are, but you told me to do something. This is kind of like a personal versus career question, but you and I are very similar in this regard. And I was thinking back to the time where I was first on your show. I think it was the wild card game, Astros versus A's. I was like giddy about it because I was like, why am I on her show? Like, I don't deserve to be here right now. Aww. But it was also like, it's my first playoff game. Like, I'm on the show with Amy Lawrence right now. Like, what's going on? It was like so much going on. But I remember, like, you can almost not differentiate having, like, because you and I are really good friends. Like, we talk about life, we talk about our faith. Sometimes you can't tell the difference between an interview with you and a chat. And I don't mean that in a bad way at all. But, and I was talking to like friends about it, like sometimes an interview or a podcast chat doesn't feel any different than talking to a good friend or even going on a date. Still not a bad thing. So sometimes do you think that I think that that's a good thing. Do you feel like that's a good thing too? Because people can open up to you really quickly. And I listen to your interviews, whether you're like, obviously you and I chat, whether it's, on a radio show or just on a personal call. And I feel like you just have this charisma about you, whether you're talking to Johnny Damon or Adam Silver or whoever, and people are very open with you. And I feel like there's something about you that is a gift where people, if they don't know you, they still just open up to you. So I think that that's something you cannot teach. True. What about it is that's a blessing, but how do you think that is how do you balance that? Because it's not a bad thing, but I feel like there's also people that might look at it as a bad thing because it's like, well, are you talking to me as a friend right now? Or are you interviewing me? I mean, I feel like it's bad when it comes to dating, but we are not doing that anymore. Thank gosh, good for you. Woo! But it's the one thing that I'm envious of you, but it's, so how do you, I guess I don't really know how to ask the question, but.
Are you asking about professionally or personally?
I don't know.
Well, so the positive is I'm a talker, right? Now, when I was a kid, I got made fun of for talking too much. I got made fun of for being loud, and it was hard because that was just my personality. But I've also always been the person who wants to bring people together. Again, just my personality, who I am. I was never really in a group when I was in high school or college. I was the one who kind of blended groups, and even now I find myself doing that. I don't know why.
Did that make you feel lonely in a weird way?
Oh yeah, you always felt well, and that was great preparation for this business, right? I did always feel like that. A lot of times,
which is weird because you got along with everybody,
right? Except that I didn't have a group, so to speak. Right. And I think walking through this business as a female. But it blazing any kind of a trail, the kind that you're blazing. I mean, think about what your team is about to do, and you're leading the forefront because you're the face and the voice of that. Walking any path that's not been walked before is a lonely road. But at the same time, I think the ability to just to talk to people like they're normal. So one of the lessons that was really hard for me to learn initially. So I started in news, where a lot more you're reading, right? You're reading a script, you're reading a cast. Even when you're on the air, a lot of it is, I don't want to say all scripted, but a lot of, what you read for news is scripted. I had to learn how to talk to people on the radio and not at people. And that's a big challenge. Once you get over that hurdle, it really changes your career. And I think probably, maybe about 15 years ago was when I was able to break through in that respect. But people can tell when you're not talking to them, right? They can tell when you're talking at them. Part of that, and this is so critical in radio, you got to learn how to listen. It's funny, right? Because people think radio is about talking, but can you always tell when a host is not listening?
Yeah.
You can tell when a host is not listening.
And there's time when I feel it too. Like there's time where I'm just like checking off the questions. I'm like, did you even hear anything that you just said? Or like they said? And sometimes you don't, like you're just trying to get the questions done. Yeah.
Right. It's really important to listen and not be stuck to an agenda and not have, there are many times over the last 12 years where I'll go into the studio with a list of topics and I may only get to half of them.
Yeah.
And initially I would get frustrated, like, I wanted to talk about this but radio is like an amoeba. It's a live being, right? It changes and it morphs as you go through the hours. And sometimes it's just better
conversation sometimes.
It's better to not be in control, right? That's how it is with friendship. That's how it is with relationship. You don't always get to control it. In fact, if you are controlling it, that's a problem. It means it's not authentic and genuine. So learning to talk to people, even when they can't see me or I can't see them, is a challenge. And you know what's crazy? I think I've told you this before. I get far more nervous standing in front of people. It's a completely different phenomenon for me to speak at conferences or to speak to classes in person or to, I teach Sunday school. I teach 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders on Sundays at my church. Sometimes when their little eyeballs are staring at you, it can be very disconcerting. So yes, I'm much more comfortable hiding behind a microphone. I do not like being on a TV camera or this camera. So I'm like fumbling with my microphone and my hair and everything else, right? It's not my comfort zone. But the skill is really about talking to people. You may not know their names, but people are people, right? And if you know your audience, which is also a big part of tailoring a show that is perfect or close to perfect for your audience, just being real. No one's perfect. No one gets it right all the time. These are all skills that I try to teach young broadcasters, because the more you can break through that and cut through kind of to the heart of people, the easier the show becomes and the more people relate to.
And is that surprising for young people? Because I know sometimes I have to like slow it down and be a little reportery, or I do like stumble on my words a little bit. Like if I take it slow and actually bring my broadcaster voice in it, I'm actually better, as opposed to I don't stutter as much. Like I can kind of slow down. So when you're talking to somebody younger and you say, honestly, just be like a normal human being, like talk like a normal person, are they like, oh, you want me to do what? Does that kind of shock them a little bit?
Well, there's a balance there, right? Because I talked like a normal human all the time. I talk so fast the vast majority of the time. Remember when I was living in Oklahoma for 4 years, I had come from the Northeast and they would say to me, we cannot understand you. And now it's, over the last 20 years, I've gone the opposite direction. I really slow down on the air. I take pauses that sometimes throw off new producers. They think something's wrong if they don't understand why I'm not talking. It's okay to take your time and to slow your heart rate down, to slow so your brain and your mouth are in sync, to slow down that process. So there is a challenge to being understandable, to being cognizant, to being clear on the radio, and also to making sure you've got organized thoughts and organized arguments. And honestly, that's the biggest challenge about working overnights when you're tired, is that sometimes my spaghetti plate brain, it all just comes falling off the plate all at once. So yes, you want to be relatable and be normal, quote unquote, whoever you are, but there are also rules of broadcast that are important to follow. And I think working at ESPN Radio taught me the mechanics, the logistics, and then getting this job the last 12 years was where the personality came in, where it was allowed, where it was encouraged, not frowned upon. There's both of that. I mean, I do think that there's something to be said for, you're a professional talker, So you don't want to have all the crutches and some of the crazy stuff that you do when you're talking to your friends, your language, obviously.
Yeah.
And so there's that challenge. If everyone on the radio, well, if every fan had a radio show, whew, I mean, we're not fans. We are professionals. And I do still consider myself to be a journalist. So there is something to be said for objectivity. There's something to be said for a lack of bias. I think there's something to be said for being the voice of calm, right? And a voice of reason, because fans are not known for logic. They're not known for being rational. So there is something to be said for the counter programming, so to speak, and being a professional, which I think is really important, both on and off the mic or on and off the radio. But at the same time, yes, you have to be relatable, because people don't want a talking head that's going to tell them, woman-splain, if you will, all the time about how things are going. And part of that is being wrong. I mean, you mentioned making mistakes, misspeaking. I mean, I juxtapose words and syllables. It's a thing on my show where I honestly, I make up new words, or 30 seconds in, I already screw up. There goes the perfect show. I mean, that's relatable, because none of us is perfect. Now we are kind of expected to be perfect, but that's just not real life.
Yeah. The other day, somebody who I thought was perfect said they screwed up on a broadcast. I'm like, I wish you told me that 5 years ago, because I would have felt so much better about myself. Like, you mentioned like a stupid question. I asked Matt Olson a stupid question like 6 years ago. And
6 years ago, I love that. You remember it.
And 6 years ago. And I found out my mentor, Susan Slusser, she said, like, I've asked stupid questions before. I'm like, thank gosh. Because like sometimes you get the best answers though. He gave a beautiful answer. It's still online. It is still online.
Nice.
So if you ever need to feel good about yourself, your girl Jess.
Oh, stop. You know what's really funny? You mentioned people being perfect, and they're not, of course, but I had a recent conversation with Kevin Harlan, and he's so encouraging and supportive. I love him. But do you ever hear him make a mistake? Like you talk about, it was maybe once 6 years ago, he made a mistake. And I've said that to him before, and he's like, that's crazy. I feel like I mess up plenty. I always make mistakes,
true, right?
But you just don't hear it.
Yeah.
And I think, again, that's part of just the process of people recognizing that you're a human, and those things don't stick in their brains. Not all of them. Some mistakes do.
Well, it happens too. Like, I'm sure like in the midst of it, you're like, I totally effed up. And you go back to it and you're like, oh, I thought I had a really bad broadcast, or I did that. And you're like, that wasn't that bad. Or you watch, or you think of the consumer, right? Because as a woman, or we're always extra bad, like extra hard on ourselves.
Yes.
And I think like the regular person watching the show doesn't understand the mistakes that we make. So you have to think about that process. And I think nobody understands that was a mistake, and we have to be nice on ourselves, but you know how it goes. But there are times I'll rewatch something and I'm like, I thought that was the worst interview I've ever done. And that wasn't that bad. It was fine.
Oh, yes. I think taking the emotion out of it for me, when I'm less emotional, and this is great, the fact that there's been a few days since I left the show, because I told you when we were texting, like the emotions will die down, but they were pretty high. Emotions were running high at the beginning. So don't ever make big decisions or judge yourself or others when you're extremely emotional. It's like retiring right after you've lost the Super Bowl. I thought that was, pardon me for saying this, but I thought it was really kind of crummy, but also dumb to ask Travis Kelce right after he loses the Super Bowl whether or not he's retiring. Of course, in that moment, his emotions are going nuts. So he's not going to be able to give you a rational answer. And it's not even fair to ask that. So yes, I try not to make big decisions or talk too much or even text too much when I'm extremely emotional, because it's just not a good idea.
Oh, I agree. Like I make the joke that the Coliseum finale, anything I said doesn't count. Like I was crying with Mark Kotze on the dugout bench. Like we were just crying together. I'm like,
but I love that last day / week was some of your best work, Jess, because it was you. Authentically.
I was very, very proud of that. And I really appreciate you. And thank you for letting me come on the show and talk about Pete Rose. That was awesome as well. Let's talk about the Super Bowl, because the one thing that I would love to be a fly on the wall watching Amy do Radio Row, just because like I couldn't imagine anybody being more in their element than you. And just walk me through, because how do you manage to stay present when there is guest after guest, interview after interview? And that's my biggest question. I'm not ever worried about like you just being prepared and getting ready for your guests, but how do you stay present when there's so many people that you have to interview?
Well, and not to mention you're exhausted, or I think anyone who does mornings or does nights, but also has to work during the afternoon on Radio Row,
Yeah.
that's a huge challenge because your brain is not had the sleep that it needs. This week, so I was home. I didn't go to New Orleans, but I was in Vegas.
Yeah.
And I think Vegas was my 7th or 8th Radio Row in person. And the challenge is, again, you work in the afternoons, you have to make coherent conversation as part of the interview process, because a lot of it's taped, of course. But then you also have to be engaging overnight as well. So yeah, I think that for me, and this is something that I learned personally during the pandemic, but it's also something that I now apply to work. As crazy as things have been over the last few years, all the extra responsibilities with only one person working on the show, I will tend to get overwhelmed if I think too far ahead. And again, personally during the pandemic, it was the same thing. We didn't know when things were going to change, when we're going to be back to normal, so to speak, or our typical routines. And if I look too far ahead, I would get overwhelmed by oh my gosh, how long is this going to be? And so I started to go one show, one day, 1 week at a time. That was it. That was all I asked of myself. Get through the next show and the next week, and then worry about the week after that. And it's the same thing during Radio Row when you're stacking interviews, especially when they're boom, boom, boom right on top of each other. And you have to meet people. You get to meet people, you get to smile. You have people walking up to you who want to introduce themselves, or people who would like to see. You catch them walking across the room and you want to run and catch them. It's about focusing on what you got right in front of you. What do athletes say? Be where your feet are.
Yeah.
It's something lines, but it's kind of like that. Don't worry about the next problem until you get there. Deal with this interview right here. Because if I'm busy, we talked about listening, right? If I'm busy worrying about my questions for the next interview, then I'm going to miss what this guest is saying right here. And so I'm not great at compartmentalizing normally in my personal life, but in my professional life, I've done a lot better at that. Focus on the here and now. The interview you got to do at this moment, because if this one sucks, then, you're going to be upset and worried about that. So one interview, one day, one show, 1 week at a time. And honestly, I think it tends to slow it down. I mean, you work in baseball, so guys will talk about how when everything slows down, or a quarterback, when everything slows down, you can see it, what pitch is coming. It's almost like slow-mo, right? Well, so that's the same approach that I try to use for radio, especially during hectic weeks like Super Week. One thing at a time, one problem at a time, because tomorrow will have problems for its own.
And I love a cliche, because cliches are there for a reason. And I used to make fun of cliches until I became one, and I was like, dude, I get it.
You're not a cliche. What are you talking about?
I meant just like what you said, when they say you try not to do too much, and I'm like, come on, dude. And then when I started applying that to my job, I'm like, I get it. You're right. I love a cliche because it makes sense. One pitcher was like, I can't think too much about it. I'm like, all right. And then later on, he was like, do you know what I'm saying? I'm like, you're right. If I do too much, I screw up my broadcast. You're right.
Well, and not magnifying the magnitude of a moment. So how often do you hear athletes who it's another game? They're talking about the Super Bowl or the World Series. It's another game. But if that's how they can manage it, I mean, some athletes manage it by reading a book about inner excellence on the sidelines. But if how you have to manage it is to go one play, one snap, one moment at a time, if that's how you're good at what you do, if that's how you cultivate excellence, then awesome. But it really is about not taking on too much all at once, because again, those problems are going to be there. How often and this is personal, worry and anxiety about things that never freaking happen? How often do we spend time, hours, just our brains, we can't rest. I'm speaking personally, right? Because we're worried about something down the road that may never happen. And if it does, you got plenty of time to deal with it. But I mean, the whole thing about cross that bridge when you come to it, cliche, it's so true.
And you and I really are about our faith, and there's nothing that God hasn't put us in front of that we haven't been able to handle, right? So there's times it's been small things, it's been big things, but it's not, when we finish it, I'm like, oh, we handled it. It may have been bumpy at first, but we did it, right? And it's those types of things. You're like, okay, I got it. I think about a bingo card or a checklist, and obviously you are the queen of interviews, and you have a craft, and you have such a great gift about it. if you had like the perfect interview, this is not Radio Row, and I'm not just talking about the question answer portion of the program. I'm talking about the whole entire element. Like you have the perfect microphone setup, like the sound is good, you're comfortable seat. You walked away from an interview and you're like, Mama nailed that. What are the elements that go into it where you have that feeling?
Well, authenticity, to be sure, not as much as we talk about cliches and coach speak, actually getting someone to open up to you and tell you the truth. But I think personal stories. So this just happened to be the last interview. I'm not saying this was the perfect one, but Ross Tucker was my last guest. Oh, yeah. He was at the Super Bowl, and I knew he had gone not because he was working, but because he wanted to be there with his family. But to get him to tell the story about how his 13-year-old daughter, so it wasn't just Saquon Barkley and Cooper DeJean who had birthdays on Super Bowl Sunday, his daughter turned 13. And she had asked him to go to the Super Bowl as a gift. Initially, he thought, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of stress to get to New Orleans. But he took her. And as he grew up an Eagles fan, she is an Eagles fan. To have that experience, it's one that he'll never forget. To get him to tell that story, that's so much more engaging and so much more, I think, memorable than whatever he might say about the Eagles defensive line, which was impressive, of course. But to get him to tell that story or to talk to athletes about why, a personal charity or project is important to them. I remember, and I know that you'll remember this too, Dallas Braden with his perfect game, Mother's Day, correct? And he had lost his mother. And I spoke to him, maybe you did too, minutes after he got off the mound. He was in tears. I was in tears. Those moments cannot be scripted. They cannot be recreated. It's so real. It's so genuine. It's so authentic. I'll give you another example too, is Josh Allen winning the MVP.
Wow.
And there's this big dude who trucks people on the field. He goes up there and he talks about his parents and how they've missed maybe a dozen games in his entire career going back to Pee Wee. They're in tears. He's in tears. I'm in tears.
Wow.
I mean, that's the kind of authentic conversation that I think if you can walk away from an interview and you've gotten to the heart of the matter. Now, not everyone has to cry, right? But that's where research comes in. If you know more about an athlete or a coach than what you see on the field or what you can get in a stat sheet. Talking to Ron Rivera this year, when he really opened up about how hard the last few years coaching the Commanders, when Dan Snyder was still in charge and it was toxic and there were so many distractions, for him to say how much I miss just coaching, that heavy weight I carried for years. That's the kind of stuff that I think makes interviews not only pop off the radio, but it makes you feel like you've done good work because they felt comfortable enough and trusted you, even in a 20-minute span, to open up to you and really tell you who they are and not just what they did on a field or the court or the ice.
Yeah. And I think you're right. It's bigger. It's the bigger than sports mentality and not something.
Right? We all deal with grief. We all deal with pain. We all deal with loss, but also we experience joy and euphoria and triumph. And who can't identify with those things? Maybe not the same way with 127 million people watching, but we're still just people. Patrick Mahomes is a dad. He and his wife just had another kid 4 weeks ago. I mean, think about the lack of sleep he's probably getting, right? But to see him with his kids, it hits home.
And Brittany just goes on the sidelines after giving birth too. Like, come on. Good Lord.
Yeah, maybe that's not realistic, but okay.
No. And I'm glad you got to talk to Dallas. He helped me a lot through my mom dying of cancer. He was a huge reason why I didn't go completely insane. So I'm glad you got to talk to him. That was one of the most amazing sports moments ever. So I'm glad you got to highlight that.
People ask me about my favorite interview ever. And while it's really hard to narrow that down because tens of thousands of them, I always remember Dallas Braden and just the in that moment, he being willing to share not just his pain, but also the victory of being able to pay tribute to his mom in that way. What he did best, the pinnacle of his entire career, right?
Well, and I think men like him, it's really great to know that like him and even Mark Kotze, you see what they're going to be able to do post-career. And even when I talk to people who played with Kotz, they're like, oh, I knew he was going to be a manager. You knew Dallas was going to be in some sort of media career after he retired. And you kind of know that those people are going to do something special after they're done with their playing careers. And obviously I work in baseball, so I can't speak on other sports, but I love those people that aren't going to go away. And you're going to, and even before I met Dallas, like I was an Ace fan. I just knew I was going to be a part of his life somehow, and now he's like a brother to me, and it's just like really cool. But that also speaks to you. Like I said, there's a charisma about you, and that is something you cannot teach. They won't be taking a class at Syracuse, from you to, it's one of those things that like, there's something special about you. And I'm so glad that you're going to continue on this journey, and being able to share that with people is awesome. And there's a talent about you that is not something you can just read a textbook about. And you're very special, and you're very special to me. And I can't wait to see what you do next.
Thank you. I think it's important to remember that people are far more important than a radio show, right?
Right.
People are far more important than the job, and relationships are far more important than whatever we do in our careers. I heard this, I don't remember, I think it was actually a pastor in a church once that I was visiting, and he was talking about LeBron James. And maybe he was at a conference, and he said, LeBron James is one of the greatest basketball players ever, right? There may never be another LeBron James. And yet on his tombstone or in his obituary, there'll maybe be 3 lines. One of the greatest players ever to walk the face of the earth. I mean, that's, people move on, time moves on. Someone comes along that's always better than you, or makes people forget about you. And that's okay. But the way you make people feel, or the connections you establish with people, I have no doubt listeners are going to find another way to fill their overnights, their after hours. They'll find a new show. They'll listen to music. They'll do something else. I hope that I connect with them again down the road. But my hope is that whatever connection they got from the show, whatever they needed from the show, even if they just needed to fall asleep, whatever they needed, it was there for them over 12 years. And that's what matters to me, is the people who connected and maybe whose lives were changed by the show.
And that alone kind of shows it. And it's like, it's a comfort there too. There's times where you just have to put something on, and it's a comfort, and that's something that can't be duplicated. But thank you so much for stopping by. This was awesome.
Well, you were the only person that I wanted to tell my story to, Jess. I thought of you first. I told you a couple months ago this was coming. I not only respect you and trust you, but value our conversation. So I knew that you would treat it with what I feel like is the proper platform, I guess, just to get the word out. So thank you.
Of course, you're the best. That was Amy Lawrence saying goodbye to After Hours after 12 years. 12 years. What was I doing 12 years ago? Voting. I was probably voting, not for the first time, but voting. I'm also saying goodbye for now. Thanks for stopping by Short and to the Point here on Awful Announcing and The Comeback. We'll see you next time.
Want even more short and to the point? Follow Jessica at Kleinschmidt JD and head over to thecomeback.com and awfulannouncing.com.